Folks are high on Oklahoma competing for a national championship. We know that they've owned the Big 12 for the past 6 seasons. We got Jason Ray on the line from Last Word on College Football. Of course, this is the voice of college football, and we invite you to comment down below your thoughts on the Sooners for 21. Of course, like the videos and share out on social media. Jason, how are we doing today?
Doing good, Mark. Thanks for having me on. I think one of the things that we talked about a little bit from spring, we got a little bit of clarity this week. Lincoln Riley announced that the spring practice will officially start March 22nd. So we don't have a spring game date yet. It's looking like mid to late April, but at least we have a date to kind of march forward to in terms of starting the spring practice.
Let's look at the defensive line. I think people would be surprised unless they really locked in on Oklahoma football last year that Alex Grinch has done a remarkable job. They were 15th in the nation in S&P plus total defense. That's the advanced metric measuring across the board in regards to getting way beyond just the surface statistics and how effective and dominant the defense was. And it was a top 15 defense in 2020. One of the main reasons why, Ronnie Perkins, despite a short season, despite missing time, still racked up 10.5 tackles for loss and 5.5 sacks when he's given all the attention. So that's obviously a huge loss to start out from along the defensive front.
Yeah, absolutely, Mark. That's the biggest guy that they have that's not coming back, certainly for the 2021 campaign, and someone certainly that they're going to have to look and see how they're able to replace him. Yeah. As you mentioned, the latter part of the year in 2020, Ronnie Perkins was very disruptive. He was really maybe the catalyst behind the turnaround from a defensive perspective the latter half of the year in 2020. So, and I think starting with your initial point, Mark, just in terms of, a lot of the optimism and the excitement. The offense kind of is what it is. I think Oklahoma fans and people across the country have come to expect the success that Oklahoma has had on the offensive side of the ball with, certainly with the quarterback and the running backs and receivers that they've had. But I think, when you talk to people, I think the biggest point of optimism is really on the defensive side. And it's really kind of exciting to talk about Oklahoma's defense, whereas it's been something that, you kind of, in the past, kind of shy away from it and not really anything that's very exciting to talk about. But in year number 3 for Alex Grinch, as you mentioned, as a defensive coordinator, I mean, I think some of the stats that you talked about, yeah, you can make what you want of stats, but I think 5 key stats that I was kind of looking at is very indicative of how much improvement Oklahoma has made. Total defense from 2019, they went from 114th to 29th in 2020. Third down defense, they were 118th in 2019, 4th in 2020. Turnovers, it's just the staple of the Alex Grinch defense. One thing that he's really kind of harped on is getting turnovers, and Oklahoma has struggled really in that area until the last half of last year. In 2019, 120th, 19th last year in two games. And I think as we talk about the defensive line here, I think one of the big areas that Oklahoma has improved, and it's really made their secondary a little bit better as well, is the ability to get to the quarterback. They had 39 sacks last year compared to 28 in 2019, and of course that's counting the shortened season, 2 less games that they played last year. So I think that's a big, exciting part of what Oklahoma's being able to do this year, or what they anticipate being able to do this year is on the defensive front. But certainly you have 3 guys that have played a lot of football for Oklahoma, and you kind of morph into a linebacker perspective. We'll get into the linebackers, I know, here in a little bit, but from a rush end linebacker, you got Nick Benito, who was second in the team in sacks last year with 8 sacks. Coming back from the rush end perspective, he will certainly play in coverage a little bit, but he does a lot of his damage at the rush end. And then you have Perrion Winfrey, who was the nose tackle last year. Really, was kind of up in the air whether or not he would come back for this season. Is back. Manning the middle. And then Isaiah Thomas, who was the team leader in sacks with 8.5 sacks over the course of the year, is back as well. So you have those 3 guys that are probably NFL guys, maybe second or third round, maybe fourth round type of guys that are coming back that have, a lot of sacks and a lot of quarterback pressure, and has really kind of solidified that defensive line for Oklahoma. One thing to kind of point out and to think about in terms of the depth for Oklahoma, Jalen Redmond is coming back this season, opted out in the 2020 COVID year for Oklahoma, has had some issues with injuries, specifically blood clots over his career. So I think he thought that was a little bit too risky with everything going on this year. 2019 had 6.5 sacks for Oklahoma. Will be very interesting to see what Grinch does with Isaiah Thomas and Jalen Redmond. If he's ready to go, not necessarily in the spring, obviously, but as we get into fall practice and game time. Isaiah Thomas played inside more at a defensive lineman position as opposed to a defensive end. His natural position, specifically at the next level, probably looks like is going to be at the end, whereas Jalen Redmond's natural position was really more inside in 2019. So I would kind of look for Alex Grinch to move Isaiah Thomas back outside a little bit to a defensive end position to allow that all those four players to be on the field at one time for Oklahoma. Really solidifies that defensive line, and they've got several people, from a depth perspective. One thing that Grinch has harped on and talked a lot about is really the lack of depth that he had at Oklahoma really coming in this year. I think they're going to be comfortable going 3-4 deep at the defensive line position and like linebacker position as well.
The voice of college football, breaking down the Sooners. We bring on Jason Ray on a regular basis to talk Oklahoma. You can catch his work at Last Word on College Football and, of course, right here at MarkRogersTV. All right, let's move to the linebackers. And it looks to be stocked and loaded and just about everybody meaningful back.
It really is. I think Oklahoma's in a great position at linebacker. It was really a position of weakness a couple of years ago, specifically looking at the depth side. And Oklahoma has last year and then coming into this year that they have the unique opportunity to go, again, very much like the defensive line. They can go 2-3 deep and really not see a lot of drop off. Certainly, you have Nick Bonino at the Russian, as we talked about a little bit ago, who he'll be the returning starter there. Certainly, then you have Brian Asamoah, who was the team leader in tackles last year with 66, had 5.5 tackles for loss. Really did a good job in the middle half of that defense for Oklahoma. And then Deshaun White returns again as a starter at the linebacker position, really manning the middle. I think it'll be interesting to see one of the best position battles on the defensive side of the ball. At least the front seven, at least will be that middle linebacker position. Deshaun White was the starter. David Agwebu played a lot for Oklahoma last year. Their stats are very similar. They played about the same amount of time. As I mentioned, Deshaun White started. Agwebu is a little bit more suited for that middle linebacker position. He's a little heavier. He's more athletic. He's more in the mold of a Kenneth Murray than maybe Deshaun White is. So it'll be interesting to see how that battle kind of goes through the spring and through the fall on who both of those kids will play a lot, just depending on where they play and how much they play. And a couple of guys just to kind of think about from Oklahoma's perspective. Caleb Kelly is really a kid that you just kind of root for to be successful. I believe this is his 6th season in Oklahoma coming up. So he had an ACL injury in the spring of 2019, played the final 4 games of 2019, didn't play more than 4, so he was able to get that medical red shirt to come back in 2020. Earlier in spring last year, tore his ACL again, the other ACL. So he's had 2 ACL surgeries in the last couple of years. With the COVID, protocols allowing him to come back again for his senior year, has come back this year. So it'll be interesting to see, how he's able to move physically with both of those knee injuries, and then, from a speed perspective, and then, is he able to get on the field as much? He's one of those. And then a couple of other guys that played sparingly in their true freshman year, and I think, Mark, it kind of points to to the quality depth that Oklahoma has had really at the linebacker position. So, late in games, you would see a couple of guys, Brendan Walker and Shane Whittier, played a little bit more at the linebacker position. In years past, you would see a very dramatic drop off. Once you got into late game situations where or you would see some of the depth, or lack thereof, the point forward, and then you really just didn't see that last year at the linebacker position. There was a lot of quality depth there, so you didn't see a big drop off when a couple of those kids came out. So I think those two kids may not necessarily start or may not really challenge for a starting spot, but it'll be something that I think Grinch will not hesitate to put those kids in and rotate those linebackers and defensive linemen a bit more, as he did. And one last name that I think Oklahoma fans probably would be interested in hearing. One of their best recruits, really the highest ranked recruit that they got outside of Caleb Williams, is Clayton Smith. He'll be the rush linebacker position. So I think last year his stats is really just kind of off the charts. In the highest level of Texas high school football, Texarkana, he had 94 tackles, 40 tackles for loss, 20 sacks. So and again, stats can kind of be misleading, especially at the high school level based on the competition. But watching his video, he pops off the tape, and he's at the position, Mark, where he'll probably be that rush linebacker position. He's in the spring. He gets to go through all the conditioning and just getting kind of acclimated to the culture at Oklahoma. So wouldn't be surprised to see him even make his way up to be the backup for Nick Benito at that rush linebacker end, because his position early on, I don't think that they're going to ask him to do a lot just in terms of reading from a defensive perspective. Really just kind of seal the end and go get the quarterback. I think it's going to be his niche. So it'll be interesting to see how quickly he's able to acclimate from a body strength perspective. Is he able to get on the field early on? But his high school numbers sure indicate that he does have the opportunity to get in early on.
Just about every other time that he gets a hold of somebody, he's throwing them down for negative yardage. So it's a dominant performance. There's no question about that. Got Jason Ray on the line from Last Word on College Football. I encourage you to head on over there to check out Jason's work and the rest of the staff there at Last Word on College Football, breaking down the Sooners as we head toward spring practice on March 22nd is the opener. And 2022 is in play, of course, on the recruiting path. Oklahoma boasts one of the best offensive lines in the country annually. And they've got a good one that has committed here just in the last few days in the number one center in the country, Demetrius Hunter.
Yeah, this was a big one for Oklahoma, Mark. I mean, I think when you look at the center position, Creed Humphrey obviously is gone, from this team. He's moving on to the NFL. Obviously, certainly there's going to be a position battle for who replaces him, but really a position in need for 2022 in terms of getting someone there that could solidify that position. And Demetrius Hunter looks like a kid that could possibly be there. As you mentioned, the number one ranked center in the country, only a 3-star on 247 composite. I think there's been some discussion about if he's the number one center in the country, how in the world can he be only a 3-star? And I think there's a couple of things that kind of go into that. I think that people that are, making these selections, making these, evaluating some of these kids, maybe didn't have the camps weren't what they were last year, just in terms of having those camps, seeing those kids out there. And, with so much of the dead period, some of these evaluators weren't able to see some of these kids. So I think that plays into it a little bit. And I think at the high school level, you don't see a lot of true prototypical centers out there. You see a lot of offensive linemen that move over and they play different spots on the offensive line, but you don't see a whole lot of true centers. But I think that that position certainly is a one of need for Oklahoma, and one that they got early on with this kid from Orange, Texas.
All right. And then there's also some news concerning Gentry Williams, news of sort.
Yeah, I think it was something that was pretty expected from an Oklahoma perspective. But Gentry Williams, who's the number one recruit in the state of Oklahoma, the number 2 athlete ranked in the country overall, I think he's at number 19 19 prospect in the 247 composite 2020 rankings, who had Oklahoma as in one of those things, him to be the top 6. He has 6 predictions, from a crystal ball predictions for Oklahoma for 2022. So I think he's a pretty heavy Oklahoma lean at this point. So not certainly surprising that he listed Oklahoma in the top 6, but certainly something to keep an eye on it as his recruitment, kind of heats up when they talk through, when he goes through and makes that decision whether it's going to be Oklahoma, because Oklahoma has struggled as of recent in state recruit. They've had a lot of the big blue chippers, 5 stars that have went outside of the state. So I think this is big for the morale, just in terms of the in-state of Oklahoma recruiting for the Sooners heading in 2022.
Jason, did you hear my phone? Did you hear that?
I did hear it. It was I was a little distracted because I thought it was mine at first, and then I didn't, because it sounded like it kind of came.
So yeah, here's my issue. Now that I've got all this audio equipment and this audio board hooked up, my phone automatically defaults to go through that board. And so if I even think if I change the setting, it'll just default right back. So when somebody calls me, I don't even have my phone anywhere close to me to have been able to shut it off. And it was really loud in my ear. So I thought, I didn't know if.
Yeah, no, I heard it was really loud. Yeah, it was really loud in my ear.
Okay, so then it's really loud. So we're going to have to redo that part of it.
Yeah.
If you can pick it up from Gentry Williams, unfortunately. Sorry about that.
That's all right. Yeah, so really one of the biggest recruits in the state of Oklahoma this year for the 2022 cycle is Gentry Williams. So, we've talked a little bit about him in the past. #1 recruit in the state of Oklahoma, #2 athlete overall in the United States, just in terms of the 247 ranking. So earlier this week, he released his top 6. Really no surprise that Oklahoma was in the top 6, considering that he is pretty heavy lean to Oklahoma at this point. There's about 6 or 7 crystal ball predictions for Gentry Williams, and all of them are pointing to Oklahoma. So he looks to be a pretty heavy lean to Oklahoma. So again, not a big surprise in terms of him listing Oklahoma within the top 6, but certainly good from a momentum perspective as Oklahoma looks to kind of buck that trend that they've had over the last few years of losing some of the high talent, in-state talent within the state of Oklahoma to other teams. Like Ohio State is one with Josh Proctor a few years ago. So being able to solidify that state of Oklahoma with one of the top recruits is going to be really important as Oklahoma looks to extend that recruiting momentum that they've had over the last couple of years.
Jason Ray, last word on college football, breaking down the Sooners for us. Spring practice starts on March 22nd. They got the #1 center committed and looking strong toward 21. Jason, we appreciate you stopping by as always.
All right, great. Thanks for having me on, Mark.